Okay, everybody, welcome. Welcome to the Journalism Speaker Series. My name is Rubina Galati. I am the faculty advisor for The Connection, which is our student media publication on campus. And we are joined by two really wonderful special guests, two local reporters. And I am going to give them an opportunity to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about themselves in a moment. And we will also have some opportunities for question and answer. So if you raise your hand, I'm not able to pull members of our audience up on the screen, but if you'll share your questions as they come up in the Q&A, I'd be happy to share them with our panelists as we go forward. And these are journalists. They love asking questions, and I'm hoping the journalism students in the room will also have some questions to ask our journalists. So why don't we start with Marcus? Marcus, introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you now? And our students would also love to hear anything you want to share about your educational experience. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. My name is
That's okay.
Marcus D. Smith. That's just my byline, but everyone who knows me just calls me Marcus. I grew up here in Sacramento, Elk Grove to be specific. I'm a graduate of Franklin High School. Actually, my 10-year reunion is this Saturday, and they're still asking me if I'm going to go. I don't know if I'll be able to make it, but we'll see. We'll see. I'll try. But no, after high school, went to Texas Southern University for communication. That's what I initially thought I was going to school for. I just knew that I played sports. I played basketball growing up, and I love, to talk about basketball. So I was like, how can I find a way to intertwine those two? And, going to TSU, Texas Southern, they just kind of refined exactly my journey, my path, and put me in a pathway onto sports journalism. And that was my path. That's exactly what I was doing. Everything up at school, from radio to print journalism, writing for the newspaper, to broadcast, doing stuff for our athletics department. And it was just a wicked time. It was a great experience overall. And then I graduated, got my degree in journalism in 2017, and I was looking really hard for a job, to the point where, as most journalists, you just have to start freelancing and just kind of start putting yourself out there and putting the work out there. And that's what I did. And eventually I found a place where I was starting to cover high school sports with the Citrus Heights Sentinel. And if you guys are from Sacramento, you know where Citrus Heights is. And they have two high schools, Mesa Verde High School and San Juan High School. So I was covering their high school sports, starting with football. And then this was 2019 at this point, and I'm leading into basketball and now baseball with spring sports. Then COVID happens, and so sports gets shut down. Everything gets shut down, and that's kind of how I ended up without a job for a little bit. And then, of course, the assassinations, really, of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, really sparked what I would like to call an awakening, really, here in the country. And that's kind of how the Sacramento Bee developed the Equity Lab, which I now work for, and which I've been working for 2 years.
Okay, wonderful. I want to hear much more about that. Let's give Byrhonda a chance to introduce herself and tell us a little bit about her, how she found herself at Cal Matters. And we'd love to hear about your educational background too, Byrhonda.
Yes, so I started in journalism unofficially, I'd say, when I was about 10. I used to get dropped off at the library and go look through archives and stuff. That was a weird 10-year-old. And then I did high school newspaper as the editor there. I went to college. I went to the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff, which is a local school. Went on a scholarship. It's a historically Black college. I was the editor of my paper there. Then I came out to California and went to Berkeley for graduate school. When I got out of the J school, I was trying to get a job, and my mom was like, you can't take a $20,000 job, which was what they were going for, $20,000, $30,000 for journalism. Just like, no, that's not happening. So I went and worked for the government, and I worked for the federal government in Bozeman, Montana for 3 years, and I worked for the government when they moved into Sacramento, and then I started freelancing because to Marcus's point, you kind of had to have this side hustle happening in journalism, especially being a Black journalist. Like, doors just weren't opening, even with a degree from Berkeley. They just weren't opening for me. So I started freelancing at the KVIE station, which is PBS. And then I started freelancing for Cal Matters. They wanted to do video. That's what my background was in. So I came on full time with them. And then I led their video team for the last few years. But then, George Floyd happened, and I really wanted to do investigative reporting. And, I saw it as an opportunity. And so I split my time between video and covering justice. And so I've been doing that for the last 2 years, but last week or so, I was promoted to being an investigative reporter, which we'll probably announce in a couple weeks, or I start in November. And so I'll be doing that for Cal Matters, but that's just a condensed version of my journalism career.
That's amazing. And so that's breaking news, right?
That's breaking news. If anybody wants to tweet it, you can, but I doubt it's that serious. I just don't want to be the person to tweet some personal news. I just find that's ridiculous, but whatever.
Oh yeah. That sounds like a challenge for some of my journalism students in there. So we sort of framed this conversation as talking about equity journalism. And so I think what I'd like to do is just to start a little bit about, maybe Marcus, you can start with telling us a little bit more about the Equity Lab and kind of how you describe it, or how your, organization describes it. And how do you kind of see your work within that?
Yeah, so again, the Equity Lab is pretty much just really the birth of not just the Sacramento Bee, but every news publication, every media, every business corporation trying to figure out how they can really, I don't want to say appropriate, but really, pay attention to, diversity, equity, and inclusion, what that means at their own publication or their own business. And Sacramento Bee, McClatchy the McClatchy company, they were no different. And so overall, I think that's really where the Equity Lab started. And what we're about really is journalism that's rooted in representation and accountability. When we talk about representation, what that really means is, making sure communities that haven't been really discussed before are getting talked about. And, when you talk about people of color in particular, whether it's Black and African American or the diaspora, whether it's Hispanic, whether it's Asian American, Pacific Islander, you're talking about really telling their stories, what's going on in their communities, and really explaining and teaching people their culture, because not everybody's going to understand Black culture the way I would understand it, the same way I wouldn't understand Hispanic or Latino culture the way someone else would. And so I'm not opposed to learning, obviously, and everyone wants to learn, but the way we can really ingrate ourselves in back in the Sacramento community, what the Equity Lab is about, is making sure that we have people that necessarily can't connect with that people feel comfortable telling their stories too. And that's kind of where the representation aspect comes from. Now, the accountability aspect, which is just making sure that we hold institutions accountable, making sure that when you talk about systematic racism, institutional racism, political racism, things like that, calling those injustices out and, seeking solution rather than, performative measures that continue to exacerbate the same cycle over and over. That's just kind of in a nutshell, really. I mean, I can go on and on about what the Equity Lab is, but in a sense, that's kind of really what equity in journalism really is. Just really those two basic things, just representation and accountability. And then, to me, always a third thing when you talk about equity in journalism is how you're necessarily, reaching your audience. And I can get to that a little bit later. I want to let Byrhonda answer the same question as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I have some follow-up questions about I'll share it now and then we'll add Byrhonda to the conversation. About representation in terms of, is it, among the topics that we're choosing, the communities we're covering, or the voices, who are the sources? So I want to talk a little bit about those sort of like prongs and dynamics. So Byrhonda, you want to share with us a little bit about how your justice reporting kind of has evolved?
Yeah, I would say that from a justice standpoint, because of the people who are impacted by the judicial system, because of racism, essentially, because of classism, and because of all the ills of the world that kind of are, pushed into the justice system. Every conversation that I have around what's happening or who's impacted by policies involves equity. And it's intentional sometimes, and sometimes it's not. But what I've learned is when I'm working on a story and I'm trying to figure out, okay, who's impacted by this? Because of the nature of the beat, and because the question that I ask myself is who's impacted, and then I try to go find those impacted people, I have to be very thoughtful about how I contact people, whom I can contact. I will reach out to people who are incarcerated, and 9 times out of 10 in California, they're Black or Latino. And so because the beat is heavily involves, criminal justice and things like that, it's always, that's who's always in front of the issues. And sometimes I have to push myself to find people who are not necessarily the face of something to, talk about criminal justice in different kinds of ways, so that we're not just talking about it and how it impacts Black and brown people, but we're also adding different voices to the conversation. And I think that's a challenge in terms of equity reporting when it comes to justice, because I don't want to, just have prison stories that only feature Black people, and part of that is, how we look at justice, but also, these issues can spread around. So that's always a challenge for me. And I try to do the best I can. And sometimes I do a great job, and sometimes people will say, hey, you didn't do this. And I'm like, well, next time I'll remember that. And, but I think the thought is to be intentional. And that's the important part.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go back a little bit to this idea of the representation and sort of like how you sort of like with the DEI, like what's the inclusive part of it? Are you including the communities, the voices? Is it by topic, Marcus?
I think it's just a little bit of everything, making sure that everybody feels seen, and I'll get to this. I'll get to one of our big projects a little bit later, but that's just kind of what the big thing about representation is, right? Is make sure that everyone in every little pocket, every little corner is seen. And, when you talk about that, what that looks like is, yes, you want people, whether they live, I'll take like from areas in Sacramento, whether they're in the Arden area, whether they're in Elk Grove area, whether they're in Oak Park, whether they're in the Meadowview, whether they're in Lamb Park, whether they're in Del Paso Heights, whether they're in Roseville. You want to really try to make sure that pockets, and speaking from my beat specifically, as the Black communities reporter, which is already really big, the Black community as a diaspora is really diverse. And so for me, that's where the representation really comes from. I'm speaking in that context. Let me just preface that. And that's why I'm saying for my reporting, it's important to make sure that Black folks feel seen in all those pockets, whether it's what's going on, things to do, people that are from there that have, created amounts of wealth or success for themselves, whatever that looks like. It's really important to tell those stories when it comes to representation. And that goes for anybody from any background or ethnicity. That's really what the whole idea of representation is really about when we talk about making people feel seen.
Okay. And Byrhonda, do you want to add to that about the idea of representation and how do you create inclusive stories, inclusive practices, or is it just because the people that you come across are from a variety of backgrounds?
It's interesting. I, when I'm telling stories, looking from a justice standpoint, I talk about, you know, prisons a lot. Not just people who are incarcerated, also prison workers is one angle to look at it. But also when you're thinking about justice in terms of courts, in terms of criminal procedure, all these policies, because Cal Matters looks at things from a policy angle. If you ever work for Cal Matters or ever an intern with Cal Matters, they'll always say, well, what's the Cal Matters story? Which, you know, we don't really know what that is. We're still figuring that out. But it's looking at policies that impact people. So trying to do that in a way that isn't, you know, pigeonholing yourself is always a challenge. But I think with the beat, again, being intentional. So for example, I worked on a story about people who are incarcerated who were moving. One guy moved 39 times in 42 months from prison to prison to prison to prison to prison. And he was mentally ill. And his mom kept, you know, meticulous documents about that. And we figured out a way. I was thinking about it, I'm like, it can't just be happening to him, right? And even though initially we didn't have any sources, I noodled on that for a year. Like, this cannot just be happening to him. And I figured out a way to find other people who were impacted. And because this is recorded, and because I don't think even the Department of Corrections knows how we did that, if you want to know, I'll let you know individually, but I don't want to say it on here. But anyway, once we figured out how to do it, I reached out to 30, 40 people who were also experiencing the same thing. And all of them were incarcerated. Most of them were people of color. But the other thing that connected them were all of them were having mental health, severe mental health issues. And so when you think about equity in terms of reaching beyond what you know to kind of, you know, find people who are impacted, sometimes you have to just get really creative. And we got really creative. And we, you know, the story was great, but I'll tell you this, the advocates, when we went to the advocates and asked them, you know, they said, we don't believe that. What? That can't be happening. That's not true. And I was watching it happen. But the only reason I was watching it happen was because I went a step further and said, this cannot just be happening to one person. Let's be more inclusive. Let's figure out a way to get voices that no one could get unless they figure out a way to reach out to all these 30 people. And that's what, you know, to me, that was equitable reporting from a different lens.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess one of the questions that's coming up for me right now is the how. Like, how do we train journalists to do this? Or you two have incredible experiences and perspectives, and newsrooms are highlighting your work and supporting your work. But how supportive is the newsroom? Do you get pushback from your editors? Like, tell us a little bit about that, if you can speak to it.
I have gotten some pushback from editors before.
Yeah, you get pushback all the time. I mean, that's a natural thing.
But here's the thing. I know the thing about being a reporter of color, and Marcus, maybe you can speak to this or not. We have stories that are story ideas. Like, I'll case in point. I'll read something in the New York Times or in the Wall Street Journal, and to them it's groundbreaking information. But because of my experiences, I'm like, water is wet. Duh, we all knew that, right? And initially, that can be, you know, you can second guess yourself. But when you're coming to reporting from different perspectives, typically the stories you pitch are different, are unique, are authentic, And there before anyone else really notices. By notices, I mean mainstream media, however you want to phrase it, notices that it's a problem. So oftentimes editors will try to redirect you. And sometimes you just have to be resolute and like, nah, I'm not going to be redirected on this. There are many stories, like case in point, the prison transfer story, where I had top level advocates who were saying this is not a problem. But then I started thinking about that thing. And when people say you're an advocate, okay, you have to have access to someone to be an advocate. If you don't have access to an advocate, or if someone doesn't find, some interest in your stories, who's gonna advocate for you? Your attorneys are gone once you're sentenced to prison. Your family oftentimes are gone. And unless you get lucky, how would anyone know anything that's happening with you? So sometimes the key to all of that, to the pushback, is to be resolute.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like the framework that you're also describing is just the amount of time that you put into it. Like you noodled on it for a year and you were pulling threads from here and there. And so just the time that it takes to sort of develop those stories too.
I would say, just to, add to that, it's also just to not just the whole understanding of pitching your story and knowing what your story is about and being able to articulate what your story is about in a way that sounds interesting to whoever your editor is or whoever you're reporting to. Because a lot of the times, how it sounds to you in your head is not exactly how people are receiving it. And so sometimes you have to check that and find a way, well, how can I explain this story to you and come off at really passionate that I want to write this story in a way that you'll see, what the story can do as far as, views and as far as momentum and, how it could possibly change somebody's life just by reading it. And so that's really sometimes for me, when I notice that I get pushed back on a story, it's not that necessarily they don't think it's important or my editor doesn't think it's important. It's the way I pitch it, or how can you tell this story to where our readers will find it something that they want to consume, that they need information that they need to know. And ultimately that's really sometimes depending on what your beat is, that's what it's ultimately about. It's providing information for to your audience.
Yeah. It's interesting. I was looking through a lot of the coverage that both of you have, your body of work, and I saw a lot of the data, like the data that's really embedded in some of the stories that you're doing. I can imagine in terms of how editors are looking at your work and accessing it that way, right? In terms of the pin, the peg, and then you're developing it with real voices and real stories. So, okay, so I want to know about your coolest stories that you've done. Like we had a question from the audience, like what's one of your favorite stories that you've done, or maybe one that you felt made an impact or that you were passionate about? I know, Marcus, you mentioned that you wanted to talk a little bit about something that you're working on. So I don't know if there's an intersection here between those two.
Worked on a lot of things, and I've had the opportunity to speak with a lot of people. I would say one of the most recent ones was it was a really cool opportunity. Recently, Gavin Newsom signed a bill that pretty much protected the creative expression rights to musicians, artists, writers, directors, things of that nature. And what that pretty much did, what it was like coined as, was the rap bill. Because there's just been for decades this we talked about systematic racism before, right? This is one of those times where you see this influx of the criminal justice system accusing rap artists, predominantly Black people, of crimes that they did not commit or that they didn't find them guilty of. They're just taking their lyrics as an admission of guilt. And so that law was really, historical in a sense. And I just spoke to a couple of artists from Sacramento, X-Rated. I don't know if anyone will know who X-Rated. I don't know what this age group is, but he was a rapper from South Sacramento, Meadowview, that was really popular in the mid 90s. And he started rapping when he was 16, and he was just talking about the things that he's seen growing up in South Sac. And ultimately, he was convicted for his participation in a robbery that turned into a homicide. Although he's not the one who shot somebody, who pulled the trigger. Nevertheless, he was released 4 or 5 years ago, and he was able to tell me his story. And through that story, I was able to talk to another Sacramento rapper, CML Lavish D. And we just had a really, really heart-to-heart conversation about the intersections between criminal activity, police activity, and gang activity. And we just had a really heart-to-heart about just life in general. And it was just a really cool opportunity. So I would say, so as a recent memory, that's probably one of the coolest ones.
Okay. Byrhonda, do you want to share with us one of your favorite projects?
Probably, and it's also a recent memory. I think was it last summer? I don't know. It was either last summer or this summer. Last summer, I did a story on water theft in the California desert. And it was an interesting story because at the time, people were in lockdown, people were buying up acres and acres of the desert, toppling over all the palm trees or the Joshua trees, and erecting these marijuana grow sites. And I mean, it was pretty intense and pretty interesting to look at. But what they were doing was they couldn't get water in the desert, so they were stealing water from these water pumps. And the story was interesting because the subject that I interviewed, the victims weren't necessarily people per se, it was more water districts. And so these water districts were trying to curtail the water theft. And the person who I was interviewing was afraid for her life because it was a huge criminal enterprise. And so trying to film her, and she didn't want to use her face. And so we had to black her out. And I mean, it was a lot. We shot for 2 days in the desert in July. It was extremely hot, but it was an important story about how drought and, asking the question about what the state is going to do with water theft in the desert. And to me, it was an interesting story because it was something that no one really thinks about. And it was also interesting because I got to go to a lot of these grow sites, and some of them we got run off of, people had guns and stuff. It was kind of scary, but it was also, in a journalistic kind of way, a little exciting. So that was probably the most exciting story I've had in a while.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. One of the things that I thought of too, as you both were talking too, like the source that you were just talking about who didn't want to be filmed. And in some of the stories that you're doing, where we're covering communities that may have been not covered very well in the past, how do we manage the question of trust? Like, how do you earn their trust?
Relentlessness, consistency, diligence. Those are just a few words that come to mind. When you're trying to repair something that's been broken before, the thing that you want to do is make sure, that you're seen. And once you show yourself, you want to be diligent in your work, and you want to be consistent in your work. And you're going to face those individuals that may not want to be interviewed or may not want to talk to you specifically. But you just have to be resilient on getting an interview. Now, if someone just flats out tells you no and threatens you or anything like that, you have to take no for an answer, right? But in some cases, I've had experiences where somebody's told me, oh, you write for the Sacramento Bee, you're a journalist with the Bee, I don't want to speak with you. And you just have to explain to them that, you're not necessarily whoever the past individual that wrote that story or whatever the case may be. You're a representative of that, but I understand for the people that we're covering, that it's still a sore that it's a burn that still stings. But the actuality is that as human beings, as individuals, as this new wave of journalists coming up, that's how we earn our trust, is really just having them understand that we are a new wave, that we are, individuals first, and that we see them and that we're here to tell their story. And and that just goes back to the consistency and the diligence, because once they see that, and sometimes it even helps that they have people that or they know that has covered you, who can vouch for your name. That always helps. But overall, just making sure that you're staying true to your ethical code of being a journalist, and that's making sure that your reporting is fair, it's correct, it's right, and it's not slandering the names or the characters of the community or the individuals that you're covering.
Yeah. Byrhonda, do you want to address that question of trust? I'm imagining that your work spans greater area, like all of California, right? So like in terms of like every story that
I'm
you're
a helicopter. I helicopter in.
I mean, every story that you're doing, are you building a new set of like sources and, having to start over with some sources?
I try to build sources with people. I am naturally sort of a straight shooter. So, I'm very honest with people. I'm not going to try to, make people talk to me. And that's probably not a good thing. I mean, journalistically, to Marcus's point, you should be relentless. Sometimes I'm just like, listen, I don't have time for that. All right, I'll move on. But for me, I just try to be honest with people. Some of these topics that, from a justice standpoint, are very heavy. Sometimes, because either people have committed a crime or they're victims of crime. And sometimes these issues can be very challenging to navigate. So I just try to be honest. I do, like, some people meditate. I say a prayer, before I tackle a lot of these stories, because I just want to I don't want to get in the way of a piece. And sometimes we can do that as journalists and, kind of elevate ourselves a little bit versus the person. And so I spend a lot of time really pondering how I'm going to attack a story or how I'm going to communicate with someone who's either, for example, on the prison transfer story, I communicated with people who were incarcerated. I talked to one guy one day and he was great. And then 2 days later, you could clearly see a decline in his mental health. And to do that kind of work, you have to be honest with yourself and honest with the subject, and also, allowing yourself and the people you're covering a bit of grace. And so, when you helicopter in, it's hard to build like community like Marcus has. And that's one thing that I hate that we don't have, is that community around your work. But you roll with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell me a little bit about, like, when you do have a source that you have talked to one day and you can see that, their mental state has changed. How do you handle that? Like, what's the ethical approach to that?
I don't have all the right answers. In that particular case, I talked to him like it was normal. He was just having some, hallucinations and things like that. And it was clear he wanted someone to talk to. Was I using him for the story? No. Did I quote him in the story? No. But I knew from that conversation, when he called me initially, I knew that he was in mental health care. And then when he called me the second time, he just wanted somebody to talk to. So I spoke with him. But I didn't quote him in the story. And I think he was okay eventually, because I heard from him again, but I just try to treat people the way I want to be treated, right? You know,
Yeah.
and sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't work, but I need to be able to sleep with a clear conscience, you know. So
Absolutely.
when you're talking to people who are mentally ill, like for example, also in that story, there were some people who wanted to, and to the point of journalists getting in between the story. This is something I had to struggle with. There was someone who wanted to use their name, who wanted to say, I am XYZ and I have been transferred this many times because I am sick. And I was going to get in between that. I mean, I talked to the guy 3 or 4 times and I said, I don't know if I should use your name. I don't want to use your name. And he was determined to use his name.
Mhm.
And I thought about it. I'm like, who am I? You know, like, who am I to tell you that you cannot sign your John Hancock on how you feel? And so I got, you know, I mean, he didn't say anything bad. He just said, this is what's happening to him. And we used his name. But that was an example of where, you know, sometimes you have to get outside of yourself as a journalist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That speaks to with my students. So we talk a lot about just the ethical principles and, you know, being able to look yourself in the mirror the next day, right? In terms of being able to live with how you treat your sources and decisions that you make. And I appreciate that story that you shared about the individual who, you know, you just sense this about him and your humanity, like your sense of like how you know, could observe him, and you decided not to use his name. And sometimes that happens, right? It's not just always about, we have the information, we have the quote, we're going to go forward. So I appreciate that very much. Okay, so I just want to remind our people who are in the room with us. We can't see all of them, but we have about 30 people here. And if anybody wants to share some questions, Byrhonda's waving to you, want to share some questions. A person, one of our guests did ask about what was your coolest experience reporting. So both of you just talked a little bit about the stories that were impactful. Somebody was asking about your career path, and do you see any glass ceilings or other barriers in your career path? Do either of you want to touch upon that question?
Yeah, that's a two-pronged question, and I'll start off with the shorter one, which is regarding glass ceilings and any barriers. I think in life there are barriers overall, some that are in your control and some that are just out of your control. And the faster you recognize the ones that are out of your control, the quicker you'll find out that you don't have too many glass ceilings. And when I say that is because if you spend too much time worrying about the problems that are in your control rather than solving them or thinking that they're barriers, you won't get over that hump. You won't, find that growth period. So to me, I mean, it's very cliche, but the sky's the limit. And so just what I did, this kind of goes back into the first question, our career path, right? When I first got out of college, I didn't have it all. I didn't have any internship set up. I didn't have any job within the field set up. And this was 5 years ago. This is 2017 now. And my first job actually moving back to Sacramento was as a manager trainee at Big Five. If you're from Elk Grove, it's the one right there on is that Laguna? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe so. Yeah. So that's kind of where I was at. And in the meantime, I'm still freelancing. I'm trying to break the mold. I'm looking at, new professional sports teams that are coming to Sacramento. Like, how can I start trying to do things that are within sports media and, public relations and things like that, do that stuff for them. And that fell flat. So fell back on what I always was told, blog and, tell your own stories. And then now everyone has a podcast. And so kind of start doing those things. And then before then I turned into, I was working as a working street team with Intercom. Now they're like Odyssey, but pretty much it was the radio stations that house 102.5, 106.5, 96.9. And then the whole reason why I applied is ESPN 1320. And so that's what I was doing. I was just promoting their broadcast and hoping that I would eventually get on with their sports. And that's what I wanted to do. And then that transitioned into something else. But I mean, when I talk about the hustle and the grind, not letting anything stop you, these are all like low paying jobs. And I'm really dedicating a lot of my personal time doing this stuff. The job that I had that's really paying my bills and allowing me to live here is I was working for the state. I was working for Covered California for 2 years. And then I started working for the Department of Consumer Affairs for about 8 months or so, something of that nature. But working for the state was just for me, I saw it as just a job, not a career, but a job, just something, to keep steady income, keep a roof over my head, clothes on my back, food in my stomach. But as far as my career, that's what I was really hustling for and really on the grind for all these other years, which ended up leading to the high school reporting job that I told you about with the Citrus Heights Sentinel, and just kind of networking from there. That led to an opportunity, with the B, and continuing to just grow. And so that's kind of what my career path personally was, post college.
Yeah. Byrhonda, do you want to talk about career path and barriers? You talked a little bit in your intro about, getting out of your graduate program and what you were willing to do, what you weren't willing to do. I don't know if there's more you want to say there.
No, I mean, I think it's interesting. Marcus and I both work for the government, which is good money. They have a good budget. I would say that, people put these restrictions on you as a journalist. If you're a journalist of color, if you're a woman, if you're anything, there are always people to say what can and cannot happen. And typically they don't come out and say it. You just see it, you feel it. You don't see people who are doing what you want to do. People are not as open to giving you the keys to the city or the keys to the industry. What I would say is I just powered ahead, right? I can't I could not let anyone define what success was but me. And there are clearly ways that journalism tries to, in my opinion, this industry can burn you out. It can burn you out with diversity committees. It can burn you out talking about diversity that hasn't changed in forever. It can burn you out, just throwing you onto these issues. Meanwhile, you're further away from what you want to do. And so what I had to do and I remember when I was coming into journalism and I was telling my mom, I said, oh, journalists don't make any money. They only make $30,000. And she's looking at me like, girl, bye. She's like, wait, are white people journalists? I'm like, yeah. She's like, there's money to be made. You just don't know about it. And that thinking changed how I thought about this industry. So I'm like, you know what? Maybe you're right. So then I started pulling 990s for nonprofits. And I'm like, oh no, there's money to be made. I just don't know about it. So then I started trying to figure out how to get the jobs where I can make a living to support myself. And once I started doing that, I started learning about different ways to think about the industry, different jobs. You don't have to stay at entry level. You can move up and you don't have to be an editor to do it. But you just have to not let anyone else define what journalistic success is for you. And if it's something you want to do, you can do it. Ignore, and I know I say that, ignore, it's hard to ignore, but you have to figure out how to ignore the limits that are placed upon us.
Yeah.
Which is horrible that we have to do that, but you kind of have to do that for your own sanity. Otherwise, you run yourself insane.
Yeah. I want to just underscore two things that both of you kind of brought up, and it was something that we've been doing these speaker series, and our panelists in our last panel also were talking a bit about it, which was being open to any opportunity, right? Like I heard that with Marcus, right? Like in terms of the high school reporting job that you did and the intercom, the street team reporting that you were doing. And, even just taking what you were doing in a trainee program at Big Five, like any opportunity to continue to pursue the identity that you were building, which was these were jobs, and the career that you're building. It's a job and a career, right? So the career that you were building, and then just the creativity. Byrhonda, when you were talking before just about like, the fact that you had this job and I think were transferred out of state, and then you came back and you were freelancing for KVIE. And so just the creativity and the ability to sort of like keep building that identity forward, right? Like, this is my identity as a journalist. This is what I'm doing. This is my body of work.
Yeah, and just kind of piggy on that. I think it's really, and also to take what Byrhonda said, really, I think it's just really fighting for your right to succeed, and making sure that you're not going to take no for an answer, in a sense. Like, you're always going to fight for whatever it is that you want to do, whatever it is that you believe in. And it's just really having this, you have to be almost crazy, in a sense, and really be dedicated to whatever it is that you're set to achieve, that you're going to achieve, that you're not going to let anybody stop you from doing that. And that's kind of the mindset that you have to have. Like, when Byrhonda's talking about, not looking at journalism as like just this one little entity to where I can make only $20-$30, but knowing that there's so much more money to be made, there is so much more money to be made. I mean, one thing that really breaks it down and makes it easier when you talk about finding a career path is finding someone that you look up to, or a couple people that you want to emulate, and take little things of what they did or what they're doing, and really create and mold yourself and as whatever it is your wants and your interests, do just. But that's really what it is just making sure that you have that drive, that desire to really want to succeed. And once you really find that desire, that's when the creativity happens. That's when the innovation happens. That's when the resilience happens. That's when it all starts to, I don't want to say come together, but that's when it starts. I don't even want to say it gets easier, because it doesn't get easier. But what I want to say is, once you find your purpose and why you're doing it, I think that's when you'll start telling yourself, well, nothing's gonna tell me no. Nobody's gonna tell me no. It's only a matter of either when or not now.
Yeah, I love that. Did you want to say more, Byrhonda?
No, yes. I just want to say, don't burn yourself out, and get with someone who can give you the game, because that's the key to journalism, is getting with someone. You can always call me. I'm sure you can always call Marcus or your professor, and they can tell you, okay, this is how you should be maneuvering. But that's key. Having mentors is key.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to underscore this too, that both of you talked about the importance of, the educational experiences that you had too, right? Like the working on the college paper, working in the college media, and getting your feet wet, right? Because your creativity and your hustle that both of you have is also backed up by mad skills, right? Like, you have the skills, you have the chops. And so like, when you go and put yourself forward, you're going to deliver. So I think that's important to know.
Yeah, no, that's actually a really good point that you make. And I don't even know how I skipped all over that, but let me just back it up, right? Because exactly what you said. I mean, that's where the creativity for me started, and the drive and the hustle started for me. It was really in college. And by the grace of God, this is why you stay close to your professors, especially the ones that want to see you thrive. My professor told me, she was saying, if you really want to get into this industry, you just have to put yourself out there. And she asked me two things. She's like, what do you want to do with journalism? And I told her I like sports. And she's like, so why aren't you talking to the athletic director? And, why aren't you talking to the sports information director? Why aren't you over talking to the director of the radio station? and seeing what you can do to get your own sports show. It's like, why aren't you doing these things to put yourself out there? And a lot of the times that's really what it is just putting yourself out there. Like Byrhonda was saying, go and get these mentors. And sometimes when it comes to going to get these mentors, you have to go find them. They're not gonna call you. Like Byrhonda, she has to go find sources and stuff like that. She's gonna call. I don't think she's gonna call you just yet. You know, you have to reach out to her, right? Reach out to us first. And then that's how it happened. That's what I had to do in college. I really had to go reach out to these folks and tell them this is what I want to do. How do I get into the right places? And that's ultimately how it happened. And so talking about the career path, that's really what I did in college. I started my own show just to get my feet wet, just for real purposes. We did stuff on YouTube with our football team, with our basketball team, covering sports for the newspaper, and then becoming the editor-in-chief for the newspaper. Ended up having my own sports show and on radio. And what all that did was make me multifaceted. Instead of looking at journalism as just journalism in a traditional sense, looking at it in this new century, and this is probably a segue into the next conversation, really, but looking at it as media, as a totality, as a multimedia journalist rather than just a traditional journalist. And that's why I love Texas Southern myself. That's why I love my HBCU, because they're the ones who taught me that. This is back like 2013, 2015, and yada, yada, yada. But nevertheless, they taught me that, like, this is where the industry is going. This is where you want to mold yourself and focus on. It's not just one aspect, it's everything. And not just for where the industry is going, but just as a Black journalist, as people of color, or whether, or for women, whether you're somehow the quote unquote minority in whatever way, you always have to try extra hard. You always have to stand out by putting 100 on 10. And so that's another reason why they said make sure you're well-rounded and you can stand out, so you have all this somewhat experience, or whether you can no matter where you start in the industry, you can start somewhere, because you've done print, you've done broadcast, you've done radio, you have a little bit of experience in all those facets. You've done PR, public relations, you've done this, that, and the third. You've been a sports information director. So you've done all this stuff. Now go out in the real world and figure out how you can find a job doing all that stuff. And that's kind of, so when we talk about career path, I don't know how I skipped over my alma mater.
Yeah. Byrhonda, do you want to add to that? I think you're muted.
All I want to say is, and this is the best advice someone ever gave me. I wish I would have taken it to heart. So write this down. People never say no to college students for like mentors. So like you could reach out to, maybe not Barack Obama, but I don't know, who's a famous journalist that you all like. I don't know. I don't know who you admire, but somebody within reach, like you could reach out to Don Lemon if that's who you admire, and be like, hey, I really love your show. And if he reads the email, he's not going to say no. Like, you can reach out to journalists all over who are at high levels, editors in chief, and they are not going to say, oh, they're not going to ignore your email. And that will be a great contact for you down the road. So while you're a student, once you become a working journalist, they're less inclined to be nice and respond. But while you're a student, reaching out to people saying, hey, can I get a virtual coffee with you? I just want to learn how you got to where you got, how you became an editor, or how you became a CEO. All of those conversations will pay dividends on the back end. Trust me. So that's all I have.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just going to put a little plug in for ourselves here, because one of the reasons we're doing this speaker series is because post-COVID, a lot of our students are taking online classes. And those of you who are in the room who might be one of my online classes, come to campus. We have so much opportunity here. My students did video yesterday. We have an app, we have a website, we are doing all kinds of stuff. And you can get your your writing skills and get them polished up, because everything that we teach you here, I always say to my students, I want you to be able to walk out of our newsroom and walk into any other newsroom and know what you're doing, right? Like the skills that we talk about, the writing, the sources, the attribution, the AP style, like all that stuff. Okay, this might be a big question for 2 minutes or 4 minutes, but what do you want our students to know about how to become more equitable reporters? Is there any advice that you would give to them about how to bring equity into their stories?
Before I answer that question, I want to just preference by saying this to the students. Professor Gulati, you remind me of my professor back at TSU, and I want to just say the same exact energy that you're putting out is what she put out. And I want to just preference this and say, you know, I don't know how I could have ever done a journalism class or just anything that's, you know, in that realm of reporting online. It's just not the same. And this also comes with experience, because when I got the job at the B, it was during COVID. So it was when everything was shut down. And so a lot of my interaction, my first time meeting a lot of sources was like this. And so it just made it much harder. Once the world opened up, it made everything much easier and it blossomed. I only say that, I only preference that because going to the class it's an experience like no other. Getting inside the classroom, it's like getting out in the real world with real world reporting. It's nothing like being able to, you know, go out and ask someone on the campus about a certain, you know, something that's going on at CRC and, you know, writing a story about that. You know, it's much easier to do that than from at home. But I digress. Regarding equity in journalism and how, you know, students can really, you know, cultivate that into their own reporting, into their own journalism, it's just really being open. I think in this world, this society that we live in, we're starting to talk about, you know, equity, inclusion, diversity a little bit more. And so just remembering that, you know, you want to be fair, you want to be impartial with all your sources, and you want to make sure that it's evenly spread around when it comes to the voices that are represented in your stories.
I would say sort of the same. Listen, and I know we're journalists and we, you know, ask questions, but are you really listening to people? Listening to how they answer. Sometimes people can answer a question and they can tell you they're in danger, or you can sense that, you know, maybe I shouldn't ask this question here. Maybe they want to go somewhere else so they can be candid about what they're talking about. So really listening is critical, I think, to being an equitable reporter, because how you listen to someone who communicate, how people communicate is different. And sometimes it's different because of where they live or their backgrounds, and being able to listen, pay attention, and really be in the moment will open doors for you, but it will also add a level of empathy to how you see things and how you report. So that's my advice on that.
Yeah, I'll just end with this, you know, the biggest thing is don't tell your story, tell their story. I think that's the biggest thing. If I can add any like last words, as I'm like just kind of thinking what equity looks like to me when it comes to journalism is, you know, you're not telling your story. So whatever you think the story necessarily is, you can always keep that in mind, but allow your source to tell you their story. Because a lot of the times that's the story that you need to be writing, you know, especially when we talk about trust, and we talk about, you know, gaining audience, and, you know, reasserting ourselves into communities. That's how you really gain trust, is really, like Byrhonda said, listening, but just telling their story. A lot of times reporters want to tell have an agenda, whatever their report is, whatever their story's on, that's kind of what they're going to report on. But a lot of times you need to just sit back, like Byrhonda said, listen, and just tell the story that they're giving you. And that's kind of all you can really go with. And I rest my case.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Any last thing anybody wants to add before we call it a day? It's been a great conversation.
If you have more questions, hit me up on Twitter and or send me an email. And that's all. If you're in Sacramento and you ever want to come to the Sacramento Press Club event, send me a message. We have the events all the time, and it's always good to have younger journalists. We also have scholarships. So if you ever see any scholarships available, make sure you apply and shoot me a message if you ever do.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you who are in the room, Byrhonda Lyons and Marcus D. Smith, their names are on your Zoom screen. Byrhonda Lyons is a reporter at Cal Matters. Marcus D. Smith is at the Sacramento Bee, and you can find their social media handles on their organization's websites. You're journalists, so you're going to go dig these names up. We will also tag their social media handles on our Instagram page for the journalism department, CRC_journalism. So follow us there as well. And somebody asked the question about where the journalism department is on campus. We're in the Learning Resource Center. So LRC 109. And our classes are in person Monday and Wednesday. So we'd love to have you. So thank you so much. Thank you for everybody who's in the room. Thank you to our guests today. For sure, you will be hearing from me again, and I will be sending students to the press club and to, pick your brains for opportunities and more information on equitable reporting. And also, I want to thank a very special person, Rianne Herrera, who helped us to put this event on. She's one of our students. She is getting hands-on experience in PR this semester and putting together these events. Yes, and putting together these events. So she reached out to you and shared questions with you. So she's basically a producer for this event. So,
yes, you did excellent.
Great.
Did a great job.
She's amazing. She's amazing. So thank you, Rianne. And our next speaker series in 2 weeks on sports journalism. So keep following us. All right. Bye-bye, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you.